At 8:13 in the morning on August 10th, 2026, the ground beneath western Colombia stopped behaving like ground. In the remote town of San José del Palmar, in the department of Chocó, a stretch of earth deep inside a tectonic collision zone released decades of stored pressure in less than a minute. The United States Geological Survey placed the epicenter almost directly beneath the town. The Colombian Geological Service measured the magnitude at 7.4 with a depth of roughly 103 kilometers and called it the strongest earthquake to strike the country in over a decade. Within seconds, the shaking had traveled far beyond Chocó. It reached Bogotá, it reached Medellín, it rattled windows in Panama City, sent people running into the streets in Quito, and was felt as far away as parts of Venezuela. But it was in the cities closest to the rupture, Cali, Pereira, Manizales, and the isolated communities scattered through Chocó itself, where the true scale of what had just happened would only become clear hour by hour, and then day by day. This is not a story with a finished ending. As of this recording, rescue teams are still working, families are still waiting outside collapsed buildings, and the number of people still unaccounted for depends entirely on which source you ask. A discrepancy so large it has become its own story inside the disaster. We are going to walk through what is confirmed, what remains contested, and why a quake that struck on a Monday morning is still reshaping an entire country 3 days later. In Cali, the earthquake did not just crack walls, it brought down a portion of a hospital. According to CNN, the collapsed sections included the pediatric and neonatal wards, with patients trapped beneath the rubble as staff scrambled to evacuate newborns and children from a structure that was no longer safe to stand in. Cali's mayor, Alejandro Eder, said that roughly 40 buildings collapsed across the city in the opening hours after the quake, a number that was still being revised as engineers reached neighborhoods that had been cut off by debris. Eder said about 600 troops had been deployed into Cali to assist the response by Monday evening, with several hundred more expected overnight and additional units requested from the national government. A curfew was imposed from 8 in the evening to 6 in the morning, intended to keep residents out of streets littered with fallen debris and unstable structures during the hours when visibility was lowest and aftershocks were still a real possibility. Roughly 2 hours' drive north in Pereira, the destruction told a similar story with different details. A bakery in the city center collapsed with people still inside. Firefighters and volunteer crews spent the following 3 days working through the wreckage in shifts, listening for signs of life between bursts of heavy machinery. According to CBS News, rescuers using vibration detection equipment picked up what they believed were signs of a survivor still trapped beneath the bakery's rubble. A street vendor named Pablo Loaiza. His 16-year-old niece, Sarah Loaiza, gathered with other relatives near the site as crews asked the trapped man to knock in response to their calls, and relatives said he appeared to respond. It was one of dozens of similar scenes playing out simultaneously across multiple cities, each one a small, desperate negotiation between hope and time. It's worth pausing on Chocó itself, because the epicenter's location is a big part of why this disaster unfolded the way it did. According to Wikipedia's detailed reporting, in the epicentral town of San José del Palmar, 20 buildings collapsed completely and roughly 400 homes were damaged, while the roads leading into the town were buried under landslides and telecommunications were knocked out entirely, cutting the community off from the outside world in the earthquake's immediate aftermath. Chocó's governor, Nubia Carolina Cordoba, described preliminary damage reports from the Alto and Bajo Baudó regions, along with the departmental capital Quibdó, as monstrous, a word she used deliberately, according to Wikipedia's sourced account of her statement, to convey the scale of what her own government was still struggling to fully assess. In the nearby municipality of Istmina, several people were killed and 70 injured, and the town's mayor, Jason Mosquera Sanchez, said the quake damaged more than 550 homes and affected roughly 3,000 residents, including every school building and the city hall itself. Chocó was already one of the hardest parts of Colombia to reach before the earthquake struck. According to CNN, apart from Quibdó itself, much of the department is accessible only by air or by river, since it has very few roads to begin with, a reality documented in a 2021 report by the humanitarian analysis group ACAPS. CNN also noted that the region has struggled for years with violence tied to organized crime groups and militant organizations, including the National Liberation Army, known as the ELN, a layer of instability that existed long before the ground started shaking, and that has, if anything, made coordinating aid delivery even more complicated. By August 11th, according to Wikipedia, more than 220 rescue specialists and 100 military engineers had been deployed into the city of Quibdó specifically, a rapid mobilization that still left enormous stretches of rural Chocó effectively unreachable in the earthquake's first critical days. Frustration over that gap boiled over in Cali as well, where residents held protests outside the city hall, criticizing what they described as the absence of authorities in some of the worst affected neighborhoods. Nearly 100 aftershocks were recorded in the roughly 24 hours following the main quake, according to CNBC's reporting, with other outlets independently confirming more than 20 distinct aftershocks, strong enough to be separately logged and felt on the ground. For rescue crews working inside partially collapsed buildings, aftershocks aren't a footnote. They're an active danger that can bring down already weakened structures on top of both trapped survivors and the rescuers trying to reach them, which is part of why engineers were sent ahead of many search teams to assess whether a given building was even safe enough to enter. That tension, hope against a shrinking window, became the defining shape of the entire response. In the first hours, Colombian officials reported just over 100 confirmed deaths. By Tuesday morning, that number had climbed past 200. Wednesday brought it to 265, according to President Abelardo de la Espriella, Colombia's newly elected leader who found himself managing a national catastrophe within months of taking office. By Thursday, CBS News and ABC News were both reporting a toll of at least 273 to 281 confirmed dead, a climb of roughly 15 to 20 people added to the official count almost every single day since the quake struck. This is not unusual in disasters of this scale. Bodies are often recovered from remote areas days after initial searches, and injured victims sometimes succumb to their wounds in hospitals overwhelmed with patients. But the trajectory matters. Every 24 hours that passed added dozens of names to a list that officials had hoped, by day 3, would be stabilizing rather than still climbing. The number of injured followed the same grim arc. Early reports from the Colombian Association of Capital Cities, known as ASO Capitales, put the injury count at 570 as of Monday evening. By Wednesday, President de la Espriella's own figures put the injured above 3,700. By Thursday, ABC News reported the number had crossed 3,971, according to the president's own statement. That is not a rounding error or a data correction. That is nearly 7 times more injured people confirmed in 3 days than were known about on the first night. It reflects both the sheer scale of the quake's footprint and the slow, painstaking process of actually reaching every affected community, especially in the more isolated parts of Chocó, where roads had been damaged or blocked entirely. And then there is the number that has become the most contested figure in this entire disaster. How many people are still missing? Here the story splits into 2 competing pictures, and it is worth laying both of them out honestly because neither side is simply making numbers up. They are counting different things, using different methods under enormous pressure. According to President de la Espriella, speaking Wednesday evening, the number of people reported missing stood at nearly 500. By Thursday, Colombia's National Unit for Disaster Risk Management, through its Director General David Santiago Tamayo, revised that figure down further to 379. That is the official government count, built from formal reports filed with disaster response agencies, cross-checked against hospital admissions, shelters, and the ongoing search efforts. But according to NPR and separately confirmed by CBS News, civilian-run databases, grassroots efforts organized by families, community groups, and volunteers trying to track down loved ones who haven't checked in, put the number of missing at more than 4,100. That is not a small discrepancy. That is a gap of roughly 10 times the official figure. Neither NPR nor CBS characterized this as government cover-up or civilian panic. Both outlets reported it as an open, acknowledged tension between 2 different counting systems, working under very different constraints. Government figures tend to lag behind reality in the early days of a disaster because they require formal verification. Civilian databases tend to overcount because they include people who may simply be unreachable due to damaged phone networks, people who have since been found and just haven't updated the list, or duplicate entries filed by multiple family members. The truth, almost certainly, sits somewhere between the 2 counts, but as of this recording, no single authoritative number has closed that gap, and Colombian officials have not offered a detailed explanation for why the difference is so large. That is worth sitting with because it means the human scale of this disaster is still, quite literally, unknown. To understand why a single earthquake could cause this much damage and confusion, it helps to understand where Colombia sits on the map. Not politically, but geologically. According to Wikipedia's summary of Colombian Geological Service data, the earthquake's location places it above a convergent boundary where what geologists call the Malpelo Plate, a small microplate wedged between the larger Nazca and South American plates, is being forced underneath South America along what's known as the Colombia-Ecuador Trench. That subduction is happening at a rate of about 58 millimeters per year, which sounds slow until you remember that this pressure has been building uninterrupted for centuries. Colombia sits at the meeting point of 3 major tectonic plates altogether: the South American, the Nazca, and the Caribbean, which makes it one of the most seismically complex countries in the Western Hemisphere. Rodrigo Leon Loya, a seismologist and geosciences professor at the University of the Andes, told NPR that while the probability of another earthquake of similar magnitude striking the exact same area again soon is low, he would not rule out continued seismic activity in the region. His point, in his own words as reported by NPR, was straightforward. Colombia is full of active fault lines, and the real question was never whether another quake could happen, only when. That history is not abstract. Colombia has been shaped repeatedly by earthquakes far smaller than this one. The most devastating in living memory struck the town of Armenia in the Quindío department on January 25, 1999. It registered a magnitude of only 6, 2, significantly smaller than the 7, 4 that just struck Chocó. And yet it killed somewhere between 185 and 1,900 people, depending on the source, injured thousands more, and destroyed more than 60% of the buildings in Armenia itself. According to Wikipedia's entry on the 1999 event, the earthquake was so severe partly because of its shallow depth close to a densely populated area, and partly because so much of the region's housing stock at the time simply wasn't built to withstand serious shaking. Bodies recovered in the aftermath were carried to the auditorium of the University of Quindío so families could try to identify them. Many could not be identified at all and were buried in common graves. That disaster became the reason Colombia adopted its NSR 98 building code, the country's first serious modern seismic construction standard, later strengthened into the NSR 10 code still in use today. 16 years before Armenia, in March of 1983, a quake of only magnitude 5. 6 struck the colonial city of Popayan on Holy Thursday, one of the busiest religious observance days of the year. According to Wikipedia, the quake killed 267 people and injured roughly 7,500 more, in part because it struck a city packed with pilgrims and worshippers during Holy Week processions, and because Popayan's historic colonial architecture, beautiful, centuries old, and structurally fragile, simply wasn't built to survive shaking of any real intensity. A contemporary Associated Press report from that week described the earthquake collapsing the roof of the city's Roman Catholic cathedral onto as many as 100 worshippers gathered for early morning services. That earthquake led directly to Colombia's first laws requiring earthquake-resistant construction materials in high-risk zones, laws that, decades later, are part of the same regulatory lineage now being tested again in Chocó, Cali, and Pereira. And further back still, in 1875, an earthquake estimated at magnitude 7, 0 to 7, 5, struck near Cúcuta on Colombia's border with Venezuela, essentially destroying the city and killing an estimated 10,000 people, making it, by most historical accounts, the deadliest earthquake in the country's recorded history. Between these landmark disasters, smaller but still deadly quakes and quake-triggered landslides have struck with grim regularity. A 1994 earthquake near the Payas River triggered catastrophic landslides that killed roughly 800 people. And even in years without a major quake, Colombia's mountainous terrain has produced disasters like the 2023 landslide near Catame, southeast Bogota, which killed at least 15 people after heavy rains destabilized hillsides above the town. The pattern across nearly a century and a half is consistent. Colombia's geology does not wait long between major seismic events, and each one has, in some way, forced changes to how the country builds, prepares, and responds. This week's earthquake in Chocó is simply the newest chapter in a very old and very dangerous story. What makes the current disaster different from Armenia in 1999 or Popayan in 1983 is not just its larger magnitude. It's the speed and complexity of the modern response trying to manage it. President de la Espriella, who took office only months before this earthquake struck, arrived in Bogota and went directly to the headquarters of the National Unit for Risk and Disaster Management to meet with mayors and governors from the affected regions. According to Wikipedia's detailed timeline of the government's response, he declared a state of national disaster, ordered 3 days of national mourning, and established what's called a unified command post, a centralized structure meant to coordinate the movement of troops, medical teams, and supplies across multiple provinces simultaneously, rather than leaving each region to manage its own response in isolation. By Monday evening, he had traveled personally to Quibdó and Cali to survey the damage firsthand, and in the days that followed, he visited Manizales and Pereira as well, meeting with local officials in the middle of the crisis, rather than managing it purely from the capital. The financial dimension of this disaster moved almost as quickly as the physical one. Colombia's finance minister, Miguel Gómez Martínez, announced the government would declare a formal economic emergency and activate a World Bank loan worth up to 450 million US dollars specifically to guarantee that disaster response funding wouldn't run dry in the middle of the recovery. The government also granted a 1-month extension on income tax payments, whose original deadline of August 13th would otherwise have landed squarely in the middle of the crisis, adding financial pressure to households and businesses already dealing with collapsed homes and disrupted work. According to the Director General of Colombia's Disaster Risk Management Unit, David Santiago Tamayo, speaking to reporters Thursday, more than 12,000 homes were completely destroyed by the quake, and more than 74,000 additional residences sustained damage significant enough to be recorded and assessed. More than 170 buildings collapsed outright. A pedestrian bridge came down entirely. 20 separate road bridges were damaged badly enough to affect access. More than 200 roads across the affected region were damaged. 5 airports sustained damage severe enough to disrupt operations, and 44 aqueducts, the infrastructure carrying drinking water to entire communities, were affected as well. Nearly 26,000 families, according to De La Espriella's own figures, were directly affected by the disaster in some material way, whether that meant losing their home outright or losing access to water, electricity, or safe roads. Beyond the government-to-government aid, private and multilateral organizations moved quickly as well. The Inter-American Development Bank said it had made $50 million immediately available for reconstruction support, should Colombia formally request it. Jose Andres, the chef and founder of the disaster relief organization World Central Kitchen, said on social media that his organization's network had been activated to deploy emergency food aid into the affected areas, adding another channel of support alongside the government-run meal distribution already underway in cities like Cali. In Bogotá itself, far from the epicenter but still shaken by the quake, Richard Emblin, director of the English-language newspaper The City Paper Bogotá, described the disaster to CNN as a genuinely tough wake-up call for the entire country, noting that sirens continued sounding across the capital afterward, as officials warned residents that aftershocks remained possible. That warning proved accurate. As already noted, nearly 100 distinct aftershocks were recorded in the first day alone, keeping both rescue crews and ordinary residents across multiple cities on edge well after the initial shaking had stopped. International help began arriving within days, though not without friction. The United States announced it would provide $5 million in relief funding to Colombia. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said the Commission had activated its Copernicus satellite program, which provides high-resolution imagery used to help rescue teams identify collapsed structures and map damage across areas too dangerous or remote to survey on foot. El Salvador said it would send 2 planes carrying a combined 100 tons of humanitarian relief supplies. Ecuador's president, Daniel Noboa, offered Colombia the use of a 47-member search and rescue team capable of operating independently inside Colombian territory for up to 7 days, along with a message of solidarity for the families affected. Venezuela's foreign minister, Felix Plasencia, said his government was ready to send its own rescue workers and humanitarian aid across the border as well. Mexican search and rescue teams were photographed by the Associated Press, working alongside Colombian crews in the rubble of collapsed buildings in Cali by Tuesday, just 1 day after the quake struck, among the first foreign rescue teams to arrive on the ground. But not every offer of help was accepted, and that decision has itself become a subject of public scrutiny. According to CNN, Colombia's government said, as the crucial rescue window narrowed, that it would only accept international search and rescue teams from a small handful of countries, rather than opening the door to every nation that volunteered assistance. Separately, El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele, publicly claimed that Colombia had turned down some international offers of rescue teams, accepting only specific categories of aid that the government had itself requested. Colombian officials have not, as of this recording, offered a detailed public explanation for exactly which criteria determined which countries' rescue teams were welcomed and which were not, and that lack of explanation, layered on top of an already chaotic disaster response, has added a political dimension to a crisis that was already straining a brand new presidential administration, barely out of its first months in office. The hardest part of this story is not the numbers, though. It's the specific individual losses hiding inside them. In the small beach town of Bahia Solano, near the earthquake's epicenter in Chocó, the mayor's own 6-year-old son, Mateo Valencia, was killed when the family's home collapsed. According to a statement from the mayor's office, reported by CNN, the loss devastated not just the family, but the entire small municipality, a community small enough that a single child's death touches nearly everyone in it. In Pereira, as rescuers worked to reach Pablo Loaiza beneath the ruins of the collapsed bakery, his niece, Sarah Loaiza, stood with other relatives near the wreckage as crews used vibration sensing equipment to try to confirm whether he was still alive beneath the debris. Relatives told CNN that the trapped man appeared to knock back in response to rescuers' calls, first twice, then 3 times, a fragile but real signal of life that kept the search focused on that single collapsed structure for hours. Beyond the human toll, the earthquake struck one of the most economically important regions in the entire country. The affected departments, Risaralda, Valle del Cauca, Caldas, Antioquia, Chocó, and Quindío, together make up most of what's known as Colombia's AJ Cafetero, or coffee axis, one of the most productive coffee-growing regions on the planet. Gustavo Gomez, president of the Colombian Coffee Exporters Association, ASO Export, told Bloomberg that coffee exports were, in his own words, currently paused as landslides and blockages disrupted access routes to Buenaventura, the country's main coffee port on the Pacific coast. According to reporting from the Financial Times, that route alone normally carries about 60% of all of Colombia's coffee exports, and the full extent of the disruption was still being assessed days after the quake. Germán Bahamón, general manager of Colombia's National Federation of Coffee Growers, said the time to rebuild coffee production capacity would come, but that saving lives had to remain the only priority in the disaster's first days. Alejandro Cadena, co-founder of the specialty coffee exporter Caravella Coffee, said on LinkedIn that the company's processing mill in Armenia sustained some damage and was being temporarily shut down as a precaution, though he said no member of the company's team or their families had been seriously hurt. The economic ripple reached financial markets almost immediately. Coffee futures contracts in New York ticked upward by roughly 1% in the trading session immediately following the quake. A small but real signal of how sensitive global commodity markets are to disruption in a handful of major exporting regions. President de la Espriella, speaking from Pereira, the capital of Risaralda, announced a 3-month economic relief measure specifically for residents of the coffee-growing region, an early acknowledgement that this disaster's economic damage would likely extend far beyond the immediate physical destruction. The scale of that physical destruction becomes clearer when you look at what else stopped functioning in the earthquake's first hours. Colombia's Civil Aviation Authority closed 6 airports outright, in Quibdó, Pereira, Manizales, Armenia, Cartago, and Buenaventura, because of structural damage, cutting off some of the fastest available routes for delivering aid and medical supplies into the hardest hit areas. Electricity, water service, healthcare access, and phone networks all remained disrupted in multiple areas days after the quake, especially in Chocó near the epicenter, according to CNBC's reporting, which noted this directly complicated both rescue efforts and the delivery of aid to survivors. The United Nations Resident Coordinator for Colombia, Maria José Torres, said the UN was working to increase its own ground presence across the coffee-growing region, and confirmed that its institutions in the country had not been affected by Colombia's recent change of government. A small but notable detail, given that President de la Espriella had been sworn into office only 3 days before the earthquake struck, according to Global Coffee Report. That timing meant a brand new administration, barely settled into office, was suddenly managing one of the deadliest natural disasters in the country's modern history. Not every story from these 3 days is about tragedy waiting on rubble, though. In Cali, according to Reuters, a 38-year-old restaurant owner named Monica Mina organized fellow chefs across the city to prepare and distribute roughly 1,000 meals a day to rescue workers and displaced families, cooking almost around the clock in the days following the quake. It is a small detail in the context of a disaster that has killed hundreds and displaced tens of thousands, but it is also exactly the kind of grassroots response that has shown up again and again throughout Colombia's long history with earthquakes. Ordinary residents organizing themselves to fill gaps that government logistics, however well-intentioned, simply cannot fill fast enough in the first hours and days. By Wednesday and Thursday, officials across multiple agencies began describing the operation as entering its final phase. According to France 24, and later confirmed by ABC News and the Korea Times, this language referred specifically to the critical 72-hour survival window that emergency responders worldwide use as a rough benchmark. The period after which the odds of finding survivors alive beneath rubble drop sharply, though certainly not to zero. That window closed on Thursday, August 13th, roughly 3 days after the quake first struck. Rescue crews in Cali and Pereira reportedly worked through their 3rd consecutive night without significant breaks, using cranes, sniffer dogs, and, when the noise of machinery allowed it, moments of complete silence so that trained listeners could try to detect faint sounds of movement or breathing beneath the debris. At one collapsed site in Cali specifically, rescuers reported finding 7 survivors alongside 13 bodies recovered from the same location, according to the Korea Times. A stark illustration of just how close life and death sat to each other inside these ruins, sometimes within meters of one another. Even as that critical window closed, officials were careful not to declare the search over. President de la Espriella told reporters in Bogotá that the government's efforts remained focused, in his words, on the disappeared, language that signaled the search would continue past the symbolic 72-hour mark, rather than shifting immediately and entirely into pure recovery mode. That distinction matters enormously to the thousands of families still waiting for news, whichever missing persons count you choose to believe. Passing the 72-hour mark does not mean rescue operations stop. History, including Colombia's own history, includes documented cases of survivors being pulled from rubble well beyond that window, particularly in structures with pockets of open space, collapsed stairwells, reinforced door frames, spaces beneath fallen furniture that can shelter a trapped person for days at a time. There is also a slower-moving story sitting underneath all of this, one that will likely outlast the headlines about the search and rescue phase entirely. Reuters reported that as of August 12th, the death toll had reached 265, with nearly 500 people still unaccounted for at that point in time. Figures that, as we've already discussed, would keep shifting in both directions over the following 2 days, as some of the missing were found alive and others were confirmed among the dead. Izvestia, an outlet not typically focused on Latin American disasters, ran an entire analysis piece asking how the earthquake could reshape Colombia's broader economic development, a sign of just how far this story traveled beyond the region itself in a matter of days. Coffee Geography magazine warned that even minor delays in processing the current harvest could translate into real volatility in global Arabica coffee prices, given how sensitive that market is to disruption in any of the world's top exporting countries. And the shipping company Maersk confirmed that terminal operations at the port of Buenaventura, Colombia's primary Pacific gateway, had been temporarily suspended entirely. None of this competes, in human terms, with the search for survivors still underway in Cali and Pereira. But it is part of the same disaster, and it is part of why the recovery ahead will likely take Colombia not weeks, but years. What happens next in Colombia will unfold over weeks and months, not days. The $450 million World Bank loan will need to be spent on rebuilding more than 12,000 destroyed homes and repairing tens of thousands more. 20 damaged road bridges and more than 200 damaged roads will need engineering assessments before they can be reopened safely, particularly in the mountainous terrain around Chocó, where poor road access already made reaching some communities difficult even before the earthquake struck. 5 damaged airports will need repair before they can resume full operations, which matters enormously for a disaster response effort that depends on flying in supplies, medical teams, and equipment to communities that roads alone cannot reach quickly. And Colombia's seismologists, including Professor Rodrigo Leon Loya at the University of the Andes, have already made clear that this earthquake does not close the book on the country's seismic risk. It simply adds one more entry to a fault system that has produced major, deadly earthquakes roughly once every 1 to 2 decades for well over a century. Before closing, it's worth being transparent about exactly where this account comes from and where real uncertainty still remains. The casualty figures in this script, the death toll climbing from roughly 111 to 281 confirmed dead over 4 days, come from statements by President Abelardo de la Espriella from Colombia's National Unit for Disaster Risk Management, and from reporting by CNN, NPR, CBS News, ABC News, France 24, and Al Jazeera, all of whom tracked the figures as officials updated them daily. The infrastructure damage figures, the destroyed homes, damaged bridges, roads, airports, and aqueducts, come directly from statements by David Santiago Tamayo, Director General of the Disaster Risk Management Unit, as reported by ABC News. The historical earthquake data referenced throughout, covering the 1999 Armenia quake, the 1983 Popayan quake, and the 1875 Cucuta quake, comes from Wikipedia's sourced entries on each event, cross-referenced against contemporary reporting, including a 1983 Associated Press dispatch from Popayan itself. The seismological explanation of Colombia's tectonic setting comes from the Colombian Geological Service's own public statements, as summarized by Wikipedia and Mercopress. The single most important unresolved detail in this entire story is the missing persons count itself. The gap between the Colombian government's figure of 379 and the civilian-run database's figure of more than 400, a discrepancy reported independently by both NPR and CBS News, neither of which has been able to fully explain the gap as of this recording. That number, more than any other in this story, is the one still worth watching closely in the days ahead. So here is the honest, open question this leaves behind, and it's one without an easy answer. When a government's official count and a community's own count of the missing differ by a factor of 10, which number should shape how the rest of the world responds? And what does that gap say about how prepared any country, however well organized, really is to count its own people in the first chaotic days after the ground stops holding still? I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Thanks for watching, and we'll keep following this story as the numbers hopefully start to close.